Good evening and welcome to the first edition of this spring education series of the Living Legacy Project. You are in the right place. And if you're not in the right place, well, why don't you stay anyway? I'm Reggie Harris. I'm the Musical Education Director for the Living Legacy Project. So thrilled to have you with us tonight. I'm going to provide some music before we begin this very exciting evening. Education, inspiration, and I'll be singing a few songs related to the Civil Rights Movement, and you can feel free to sing along because these are all songs that were sung in community, continue to be sung to this day. But we know that the songs were the glue that kept those in the movement energized and feeling like they could have an impact on a nation that very much needed what the movement was trying to achieve. So we're all still wading in the water. So sing that with me as we get ourselves ready for an evening of inspiration. Chorus goes, say, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Say, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Say, who with us children all are dressed in red? God's gonna trouble the water. They must be the ones that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Say, who with us children all are dressed in white? God's gonna trouble the water. Must be the ones getting ready to fly. Say, God's gonna trouble the water. I hope you are sitting there, maybe with a tasty beverage in front of you, or you're sitting there with someone that you love or at least like tonight. You're gonna be feeling the vibes of the movement coming right through this screen. And also, this is going to be a program that is very timely as we face a very challenging time. Who with those children all are dressed in blue? God's gonna trouble the water. They must be the ones made it through. Say, gonna trouble the water. Well, who with those children all are dressed in white? God's gonna trouble the water. Must be the ones that are ready to fly. God's gonna trouble them. Sing it with me, say, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Say, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Say, God's gonna trouble the. Sing that over. Say, God's gonna trouble the water. Well, God's gonna trouble the water. Children, say, God's gonna trouble the water. Hey, God's gonna trouble the water. Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. We know that that particular song is a song that has been part of the movement toward justice and freedom since really the Underground Railroad. And since the 1700s, people singing into the desire to find freedom and justice. And welcome tonight as we continue to celebrate the fact, yes, celebrate the fact that for all of that time, brave and courageous people of different races and colors and creeds and backgrounds have been seeking to make a difference. And tonight we're going to be having an amazing discussion, some information on how we can deal with this very challenging time in which we find ourselves. I'm really excited because this very week, at the end of the week, I'll be flying down to Savannah, Georgia for our very first pilgrimage in the Low Country in South Carolina and in Georgia. And we'll be singing some of those songs as well, songs that were birthed in that place in America where rice was being grown and where slavery had a very firm foothold in the 1600s. Folks keeping their history alive on Johns Island and in Charleston, South Carolina. Song, Sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, my Lord, I know the road. The songs galvanized communities as they sang, and they reminded themselves that even those who were in slavery could have power if they stayed in community. Sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, my Lord, I know the road. Sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, Lord, I know the road. I say, sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, my Lord, I know the road. Sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, Lord, I know the road. They sang to remind themselves to stay aware of opportunities to escape. And if they themselves could not escape, stay aware of opportunities where they could help somebody else. We're talking community here. Well, don't you know the road by the singing of the song? Yes, my Lord, I know the road. Don't you know the road by the singing of the song? Yes, Lord, I know the road. Well, don't you know the road by the praying of the prayer? Yes, my Lord, I know the road. Don't you know the road by the praying of the prayer? Yes, Lord, I know the road. I see sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, my Lord, I know the road. Sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, Lord, yes, my Lord. I see sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, my Lord, I know the road. Sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, Lord, I know the road. Well, oh, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, my Lord, I know that road. Oh, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, Lord, I know the road. Oh, well, I say, sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, my Lord, I know the road. Sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yes, Lord, I know the road. Well, welcome again. I'm Reggie Harris, Musical Education Director for the Living Legacy Project, and we have got an amazing webinar for you tonight. So I want to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for singing. And I'm going to turn this back over to our Director of Operations, Annette Marquis, and she's going to introduce you into this marvelous night of inspiration and information. So get comfortable and be ready to be inspired. Annette, it's all yours.
Thank you, Reggie, and it is great to have you all here tonight. It's such an honor to start this webinar series, and we're very excited about it. And I'm going to pass it directly to our illustrious, the Reverend Dr. Gordon Gibson, who will take things from there.
Well, thank you, Annette. This is going to be an interesting evening. We have two excellent guests, and I think we'll find that some stimulating discussion of how a flat-out lie can really take hold in a community and have a lasting effect. So we have two guests with us tonight. Chip Brantley is a co-host of the NPR podcast White Lies, which was a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize in audio reporting and recipient of the Edward R. Murrow Award for Best Podcast given in 2024. This is quality work that was done. He's the author of the book, The Perfect Fruit. Chip's work has appeared in Slate, Gourmet, I think he likes food, the Oxford American, New York Times, and the Washington Post, among other places. An instructor in journalism at the University of Alabama, Chip helps with the Desert Island Supply Company, a nonprofit creative writing program for students in Birmingham, Alabama. So, welcome, Chip. Good to have you here. And
thank you, Gordon.
His sidekick, his partner in this.
Sidekick's right, Gordon.
In the White Lies podcast was Andrew Beck Grace, co-host and producer of the NPR podcast White Lies. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Usual Suspects, PBS, Independent Lens. His film, Eating Alabama, premiered at SXSW, which I think South by Southwest, aired nationally on PBS and was awarded Best Documentary by the James Beard Foundation. His interactive documentary, After the Storm, was a co-production of PBS's Independent Lens and the Washington Post. It's been exhibited internationally and was nominated for an Emmy in New Approaches to Documentary. Andrew teaches nonfiction filmmaking and journalism at the University of Richmond. So, welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having us. I am the much younger partner of Chip there. That's the sidekick. The age jokes have to start at some point. He has like
they had to start.
years on me, and it's all
that was
we
early.
Yeah,
that was early. We're the same generation. We're essentially the same age.
We'll move on.
Well, I hope tonight doesn't age you greatly. The White Lies podcast, which as I recall was broadcast, or whatever one does with a podcast, in 2019, looked at the murder of my colleague, James Reeb, in Selma in 1965, and looked at a weird thing that happened to his demise. It changed for white Selma. Factually, what happened was that Jim and two others, Clark Olson and Orloff Miller, had their dinner in a small black restaurant on Washington Street in Selma, and were leaving there to walk back to Brown Chapel AME Church for a mass meeting that evening. And four white men came across the street and attacked them. Jim Reeb was hit in the side of the head with a club of some kind. Others were punched and kicked. And Jim was the worst hurt of the three. They supported him and walked around the corner to the insurance agency, which had been sort of the headquarters for Dr. King. And he was taken from there to a hospital for Black Selma. And they said, he needs more than we can do here. He needs to see a neurosurgeon in Birmingham. And so was put in realistically, it was a hearse. Black Alabama doesn't have excellent ambulances. Hearses have to double, and was taken to Birmingham. And Chip and Andy heard the story from Clark Olson. I've heard the story from Clark of holding Jim's hand as they rode up the back roads to Birmingham and feeling the moment when Jim's hand went limp. That's what really happened. But in White Selma, a whole different story took root. That basically the civil rights movement needed a martyr, maybe ideally a white martyr, better, punchier PR. And Jim wasn't that hurt when he was put in the ambulance, but was nearly dead when he got to Birmingham. That's the white lie. And Andy and Chip, fill me in. The podcast ran several hours. Obviously, I have super simplified, but what important pieces didn't fit there in my super simple summary?
Well, I think that's just getting at sort of the genesis of our interest in the story. I mean, and Chip and I just had a brief call this afternoon about trying to we made a second season since this story was in my mind a story like no other. I mean, I don't think it's often that a journalist comes across a story as fruitful as this one was for us. And so we have worked on other stories, but we just can't stop thinking about the kind of serendipity of reporting this story, and just the meaningful nature of the connections we had with certain people as we reported it. But to go back to the very beginning, the way that it all got started, which kind of answers your question about sort of what is it about and how did we come on to this thing that we ended up calling the counter narrative, is that a reporter friend of ours, Jerry Mitchell, who's a very famous Mississippi-based journalist who was instrumental in lots of civil rights era cold cases. Clark had been with Jerry and had given him at some point this FBI file, and Jerry was never able to really work on it. So I called Jerry saying like, "Hey, what's we were just catching up," and he said, "Oh, well, if you're working on Selma, you should maybe look into this case." So that's kind of how, and when we first looked at it, as journalists do, when you analyze a story, if you're going to tell a story, we started thinking about, well, where might it go and what might it look like? And the story of Reeb was, at least I thought I understood the civil rights movement pretty well. I mean, I'd studied history and I'd studied a lot of Southern history and contemporary Southern history. And Jim Reeb is not really he's a kind of a footnote. I mean, you understand the story of Jimmy Lee Jackson and Viola Liuzzo, partly because of the Klan, and of course Jimmy Lee Jackson because he's this black man who's killed that begins the march in the first place. But Reeb is complicated, and maybe there's not even really, maybe that's just a complex story. And we didn't, and complexity sometimes isn't great for storytelling. If the complexity is easily understood as just the factor of several things being askance all at the same time. But this became pretty quickly after going to Selma, we realized that the complexity here was because White Selma had told a certain story about what happened to Reeb. And it wasn't a story that was borne out by the facts, even just the layman's understanding of what had happened, the eyewitness testimony of people on the street. Not even if you didn't have the FBI file, if you'd watched Eyes on the Prize, for instance, you would know that there was verifiable information out there that this was not what had happened to Reeb, that he'd been attacked on the street, that they'd done everything they could to get him to Birmingham, that he had this really grievous injury. And so we started wondering, why, as white Alabamians, were we not told this story? And was it because so many people believed this counterfactual, this counter narrative? And I think that's really when we knew that there was a story to tell here. That was before we had discovered the fourth attacker. That was before we had really spent years of our lives, literally years of our lives in Selma. But just that idea that maybe something was hidden from us because of a lie became kind of the metaphor, the sort of guiding metaphor for our investigation, I guess. Chip, that's my version. What's your version? talk about this, we always have to make sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, two things kind of related to that, the origin. We got this FBI file, which was really just an incredible roadmap. Because the FBI in 1965, of course, Gordon, as you know, was everywhere around the South, especially in Selma, where um, the voting rights campaign had been going on for a little over 2 months at this point. And so there were lots of agents on the ground here. And so after this attack, even though, if you know the story and listen to the show, no one was ever held accountable. The FBI did a pretty robust investigation, knocked on a lot of doors, talked to a lot of people. And if you request that FBI file, as we did after we received the unredacted file, you get a redacted file that's not even the complete redacted file. Um, so having that was just an incredible roadmap. And then, as Andy said, we encountered this, and Gordon, as you alluded to, we encountered this counter narrative really early. You'd tell people, people ask why you're in town, what are you working on, what are you doing here, and you tell them, and they'd say, "Oh, is that the guy that that's the guy that they killed on the way to Birmingham, or that's the guy that they let die on the way to Birmingham, or didn't it take him?" I mean, this is the son of the defense attorney from 1965 said, "Didn't it take him like 12 hours to get him to Birmingham?" So I mean, it was this. You realize you're on the other end of this decades-long game of telephone, and it's partly telephone, it's partly benign. I think some people just don't bother to learn the story, but of course, it's also there's a not benign part of it. There's a malignant part of that story, and that's what we became really interested in. And then we had this moment, which I thought about last week when it was the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in March. Well, not quite to the March, but 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, and the Jubilee was going on. And I remembered that it was 10 years ago when President Obama spoke at the 50th anniversary. And we were down there and we decided we were early and we were looking for a parking spot. And we went to the Confederate circle in the old Live Oak Cemetery just to kind of poke around and park near there and walk to town. And they had it sort of surrounded and fenced off, and we're essentially guarding it, the sons of the Daughters of Confederacy and the Friends of Forest, because they were afraid someone was going to steal the new bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, which had happened before. And we're basically, I mean, they weren't armed visibly. Maybe they were armed somewhere, guns somewhere, but they were basically guarding the place. And we started talking to a woman named Pat Godwin, whose voice you don't hear in the show, but who's invoked in the show, who's referenced in the show, because she is the president of the Daughters of the Confederacy chapter there, and a sort of founding member of Friends of Forest, the organization that is sort of essentially the caretaker of the old Confederacy circle in the cemetery. And she gave us, among other pamphlets, she had a bunch of them in the backseat of her car, just sort of ready to distribute to anyone who would take them. One of the pamphlets was the truth about Jim Reeb, and it was this facsimile of a letter that had been written in 1965 by a noted white supremacist in town, the sort of de facto secretary to the sheriff, Jim Clark, and some other information, some other pamphlets. Like Andy, I wish I could find them. We could share them, but like the true facts about 10 facts you need to
One of
know
them was
about what
called
happened to Jim
Sex and
Reeb.
Selma, that was all just like pictures of
Yes.
black people and young black people and young white people together, just in the street. But the innuendo is that this was a big orgy, basically.
And so she gave us this letter, which in our mind, when we read it, was like, oh my God, this is the origin of this lie. This is the origin of this counter narrative that Jim Reeb was either killed by his friends and his compatriots, or that they, as you said, Gordon, let him die because he needed this white martyr to sort of further the cause. And so finding that letter really was like, oh my God, it's still in the water. This has been passed along for 50 years, and people are still drinking it.
How many years did you spend talking to people? You expended immense energy knocking on doors repeatedly and
But when we
getting,
started, I had incredible hair.
You did
It
better than
was
mine.
amazing. Yeah, better than Andy's. That's right. When did we start?
When
2014?
we started, it's funny because you sometimes are shy to tell the true origin stories of a particular project, and in this case, I am kind of shy because um, it sounds a little, I don't know. I think the reason why we started it is because the 50th anniversary of the marches in 1963 had happened in a couple of years before. This is 2013, 2014. So that the tail end
right.
of those memorializations of the 63 Children's March had happened. And I think we were teaching actually. We were teaching a class together at the University of Alabama, and we were looking for a story
Mhm.
connected to the Voting Rights Act. And I didn't know much about Selma. I had a close friend who was a civil rights foot soldier, Teresa Burrows, who lived in Greensboro in Hale County, and my wife and I used to take her to the Jubilee in the early 2000s. And like she passed away in probably 2017 or 2018. But back in 2005, 2006, 2007, we would go. But that was my only encounter with Selma. It was through helping Miss Burrows go to this memorialization, go to the prayer breakfast, and then so I don't even think we walked the bridge necessarily, but we were just sort of there to help her get there.
Mhm.
But I had no, as an Alabama, I grew up in North Alabama. I had been living in Tuscaloosa. Selma's just not a place that most Alabamians go. And so the bridge, the sort of Bloody Sunday and the march was something that obviously are huge moments in civil rights history, but I didn't know much about them. So we thought, well, the 50th anniversary of this big event and the signing of the Voting Rights Act is coming up, so maybe we'll find a story in someone. That was honestly like as generic as it sort of was. That's when Jerry gave us that file, and we met Clark Olson, and we spent time with Clark in Asheville,
Yeah.
and Clark's memory of it and Clark's reckoning with it. We made a small piece for the New York Times that aired on the 50th anniversary of the march that was just about Clark and his own memory. Didn't have anything to do with who actually committed the crimes. But in that process, during that time of going down to Selma and talking to people, we had discovered that there was still some knowledge there that hadn't really been shaken loose, that no one had really asked the right questions. And I always defer to my big buddy Chip. Chip's got a couple of years on me and maybe 8 inches on me. He's a lot taller than I am. And
I thought we were done
his
with the age checks.
well, I had to. If I'm
Yeah,
going to tell
yeah,
them how much taller you are than me, then I have to
that's
also
right.
remind them that you're older than
That's
me.
right. Right.
Uh, his tenacity with just finding a name and saying, let's knock on their door. And that began, honestly, one of the first times we went to Selma, which is we went right to where Reeb's marker is, where he had been attacked. And sitting right there is an empty lot. And then right next to the empty lot is this squat little brick building that was probably built in the 80s or the 90s. And it says Selma Bail Bonds on the front of it.
Mhm.
And because it was right there, Chip said, let's just
Yeah.
go in. So we went in and there's an older lady sitting there. And one of us said to her, like, we were just here, interested in the Reeb Memorial, interested what you know about the story. We're from Tuscaloosa, we're just from up the road. We're just kind of wondering about the Reeb story. And she said, well, not only do I know what happened, but I was there on the street that night and I saw everything. And that's the sort of thing that just doesn't happen to reporters. And so I think at that point we just knew, well, there's a source to cultivate. There's a story that she wants to tell but doesn't know how to gain. We haven't gained her trust. We don't know her yet. So that was 2014, and we worked on the story on and off. For those of you who haven't listened to the podcast, that goes into discovering this fourth attacker, Bill Portwood. I hate to spoil it for you, but and Portwood he was older at the time that we first met him. He was aphasic and he had had several strokes. And there was a big, and still is, and I think we address it in the show, some ethical considerations about how we interviewed him and how we talked to him about this thing that he admitted being a part of, but also at other times claimed to not have any memory of.
Mhm.
And honestly, that stuff was so legally fraught from our perspective as journalists that I think we kind of shelved the story for a little while because it felt like without a distributor, without the support of a place like NPR, it would be really hard to figure out how to legally approach those kind of tricky ethical issues. So we set it down, worked on something else for a year or two, but we would always keep going back. In fact, I think it was Chip by himself one time driving through South Alabama or that part of the state rather, who happened in to go visit Portwood and recorded him on the record talking about attacking Reed. I wasn't there for that. That was all Chip. But we were talking on the phone the whole time. He said, I think I'm going to swing by Selma. And I was like, let me know how it goes, you know? So we weren't even really, but once we had that tape, we knew we had something. And then we took it to NPR and they basically vetted the story and heard all this stuff that we had. And they said of that bail bondswoman, her name was Frances Bowden, that if Frances would go on the record and tell us what she knew, then they would come on board to help us do that. And then that was another 6 or 8 months, honestly. We had cultivated Frances for years. Every time we were down there, we would visit her. We would spend time with her. We heard all kinds of stories about her medical problems and her daughter's medical problems, and really in many ways came to care about her, even though she was a very problematic person to deal with. You know, she'd lived really rough life and had had a lot of really rough men in her life. And I feel like we generated a lot of empathy for her, I think, in that process. And eventually, after denying our requests over and over and over again, or saying she would be there and not showing up, and etc., we just showed up in Selma one day. I had my recorder and I said, "Can we sit down? Is now a good time?" And she told us everything she knew. And the bulk of her tape from that show is from that one day that we sat down with her. We interviewed her several times, but that day that she finally said, "I'll tell you now" on the record, was pretty huge for us.
Yeah. So 5 years, that's a long time. And most journalists need to turn something in hours, days, maybe if they're lucky, weeks.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
We're fortunate in that we have academic jobs for now. May not be academic jobs soon, but we have them now, and it really it does give you the luxury of some things, which is time. An important thing for a story like this, as Andy just outlined, is time.
Yeah.
And to be able to drive down on a Wednesday and not have any obligations to turn a story around, or call your editor, or do any of that stuff that you do at a daily newspaper, or those don't exist anymore either, at a publication. So we were really fortunate in that way. And in fact, this is a story that one of the forms of resistance that we ran into in Selma was just fatigue, mostly among white people, but not entirely. That, another person who doesn't live in Selma is coming down here to tell the same damn story over and over again. It's the only story people have told for 50 years. There's nothing new. You're going to dig up the same stuff. I mean, a woman who was I would say, a strong ally in Selma, who I think loved the show, who would never talk to us on the record, and was sort of initially, at least, resistant to what we were doing, because she said, you're just gonna come, dig this thing up again,
Mhm.
and nothing is going to come of it. It's not going to do anything for Selma. And that's another thing we constantly heard, that as someone memorably put it, Selma did so much more for the civil rights movement than the civil rights movement ever did for Selma. And in some ways, that's undeniable. And it's hard to argue with people when they say, "Ugh, you're back to do the same thing." And so, yeah. So we were fortunate that we were close, A, and B, that we had the time to just come and do what essentially an old school beat reporter does, which is just sort of hang out, talk to people, and get to know the lay of the land. And at one point, we had a long list of, I think we made a list of everybody who's even referenced in the FBI file, many of whom were barbers for some reason. Not many, but like there were more barbers represented as an occupation than anybody else. I guess because barbers hear a lot, like bartenders, I don't know. But we tried to find a lot of barbers and couldn't find any of them. But we tried all of them, I think.
Joanne's brother, doesn't he cut hair? He's not really. He wasn't.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure it helped a lot that you had Alabama addresses, you had Alabama identity. somebody with a nasal accent and New York address, no. Door gets slammed if it ever gets opened. But you were swimming upstream. You were talking to people who clearly saw, these guys are sort of on the other side from me. How do you, actually, this is an important question in these days. How do you get into productive conversation with someone who is coming from a different viewpoint than you are?
I'll just say two things, and then Andy's been reading the news a lot more than I have lately, so he maybe I'll tee him up. But um, it's funny you say that about being from Alabama and having Alabama addresses, both of which are true. Well, both from Alabama. We were both living here at the time, um, and uh, story I love to tell is we would kind of do this like, look, I grew up in Birmingham, and you do the whole like, I get it, you're tired of this story. Birmingham's been through the same thing. Birmingham is sort of, known as. I remember meeting a German couple in my 20s, and they were like, "Oh, Birmingham, the dogs and the bomb," and you're like, "Well, yeah, but um,
Yeah.
and so I would try that tactic and tried it a lot. And somebody finally said to me, somebody who was sympathetic, I think, to what we're doing, but just said, just stop. Don't say that anymore. You're better off saying you're from Chicago than saying you're from Birmingham. Which I think is true in a lot of ways, because Selma, as Hal Raines memorably said to us, Selma, what was it exactly? He said,
Oh God, it's so
Selma is
good.
its own sort of weird or something, like, just
Yeah.
there is such a pride among old Selma. They have a phrase, my people dug the river. So if you are of a certain lineage who's been there a long time, your people dug the river. And so there's a real pride there. And so Birmingham, is a post Civil War city. It's didn't even exist. It was a secluded valley, in 1872, when settlers discovered that there were steel making ingredients here. So I think that helped and didn't help in a lot of ways. It certainly helped, I think, that we're white. I think that helped a lot. Um, and, I think in terms of doing the work then for this story, and I think this is maybe instructive. We're working on a different story now that is similar in some ways. We had this mantra, or we had this phrase that had the convenient value of being true, but was also a really effective thing to say to people when trying to talk to them, which is, we're just trying to get to the truth about what happened to Jim Reeb. That's it. It's our only agenda. We're not here to do anything except get to the truth about what happened to Jim Reeb. And if you're Pat Godwin, president of the Daughters of the Confederacy in Selma, and part of her frustration is that the world has come to believe this absurd story that Jim Reeb, died from the attack on Washington Street in Selma, and she thinks that's absurd and thinks that the whole world needs to know that the civil rights movement was responsible for killing Jim Reeb. That's the truth the world needs to get to. But you can both agree that a really valuable goal is to get to the truth about what happened. And so that got us in some doors. And I think it honestly allowed us to have conversations with people on not neutral ground, because, if you're looking back into the story for, as Pat Godwin said, the world's largest communist organization, National Public Radio, that's what she called it. If you haven't listened to the show, very funny. But if you're working on the story for NPR in 2015, you obviously have a certain orientation to the story that that anybody can sort of pick up on. But it was a helpful thing to be able to say that you're just trying to get to the truth, because even people who are misinformed by that counter narrative, or by something their parents told them, or they're still think that they're getting to the truth of it.
Yeah, I would just say it's being white, it's being from Alabama. It's also weirdly being able to talk not just about Alabama football, but like the running back class of Auburn as well. I mean, just the idea of being able to have a kind of
Yeah.
vernacular conversation about the best barbecue in town and everything. I mean, the cultural trappings of being a white Southerner can really help you in those spaces. And
Mhm.
yes, there was distrust for sure. But I will say, I think we're all as a country right now really struggling with how do we talk across a divide. And I think there's something actually maybe unhelpful about our approach, which is we wanted to extract information. It was less about empathy and more and trying to get people to change their mind. From a reporter standpoint, that we needed to get that information. And I'm I'm teaching a Chekhov story tomorrow, so I've just been thinking about Chekhov today. And there's this great line that it's not the task of the writer is not to solve the problem, but to state the problem correctly. And I
Mm.
feel like we wanted to not solve the problem for the people of Selma. They weren't our audience in many ways, but we needed to extract what had happened there, what they understood about it, so that we could state the problem correctly, so that we could say to the world, basically, here's how this story unfolded for people in Selma. Here's how whiteness treats this kind of cognitive dissonance. Here's what white supremacy does to people's minds. And so in a way, there's a betrayal in many ways at the heart of the journalistic practice that we are asking people to give us their secrets only to take them and do what we will with them. And you have to be rooted in this ethical practice that you believe that there's a virtue to the story that you're telling. But sometimes you can't see that in the middle of it. You have to just believe in yourself, and also, of course, treat people with dignity and have respect for them. But it's a little different, and I feel like I'm not actually good at trying to explain to people how to talk across political divides. And just one brief example of that. There was a woman who came to work on our show just briefly. NPR, I think, was thinking about, we had never, Chip is a book writer, I was a nonfiction filmmaker. We'd worked almost exclusively in long form stuff and had really thought that way. But NPR didn't know us, I mean, they liked us, but it was early in our careers and we didn't have the chops. And so they thought, well, maybe we'll bring someone in to listen to some of this tape and sort of help these guys if they need help. And thankfully, we didn't need help, but this person was still very helpful in many ways. But what she did was she listened to some of the tape that we had with Francis, who had been there on that street that night and listened and watched what had happened. Then she lied at trial. She lied to the FBI, and now she's telling us this whole story. And this person who listened, who's a really well-established radio producer and really well respected in the field, and I have a ton of respect for her as well. She had a real problem with the tape, with the raw tape itself, because she didn't hear us pushing back on Francis at all. When Francis would say something racist, she didn't hear us say, "Well, I can't believe you would say that," blah blah. And she would things that you would naturally want to say if you were in that conversation. But there's a great deal of restraint in the journalistic practice too, where I need you to keep telling me these things. My job is to get the story of what happened so that I can then, I do believe that we're both sort of, we love history. We think a lot about history. I was kind of trained as a historian. I think of that idea of the journalist as the first draft of history. Our job is to figure out the truth of what happened. It's not about making friends. It's not about correcting somebody's morality. It's not about changing the way they vote. Our job is to try to figure out what exactly happened. What tools can I use, talking about the Auburn running backs, talking about barbecue, being white, being from the South. Those are tools that I use to do that. But as it relates to this current moment that we're in as a culture and as a politics, it is hard for me to understand how to take those talents and turn them into convincing people they should see the world differently. I guess, sorry, to finish that, I would say our hope has always been, and the stories we've chosen and the kinds of things we've been interested in pursuing together, has always been to tell stories that have the opportunity to reach out to someone who might be a little skeptical, someone who
Mhm.
might not have ever really thought about the world in the way that we're bringing it to them, and offer that kind of kindness to the listener to bring them in. We're not presupposing that you're going to feel exactly what we feel, but we're trying to tell a story that helps you get to the place where we got in the reporting of the story. So maybe in some way there's some empathy there that's extended to the listener, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just real quick on that, Gordon, it just occurs to me that, we interviewed Bill Baxley and Doug Jones. Bill Baxley, when we interviewed him, I'm sorry, Bill Baxley used to be the Attorney General of the state of Alabama in the 19th. He was elected in 1970, I think.
Yeah.
Was the youngest Attorney General in the country, I think, and was intent from the moment he came into office on prosecuting some of these civil rights era um, crimes. And he talked about that the fact that when he requested the Birmingham Police Department files for the church bombing, 1963 church bombing in Birmingham, that they were almost unusable because the Birmingham Police Department had focused almost exclusively on investigating the Black community in Birmingham and the sort of civil rights committee and the civil rights uh, uh, protesters in Birmingham. Um, Again, as a way to generate sympathy for their cause, that the Birmingham Police Department investigated the the Black community and the civil rights protesters, and so there was just nothing really usable in those files. Doug Jones later came in as U.S. Attorney in Alabama and sort of followed up, picked up some of what Baxley had done in the 70s, and um, and Doug said to us, it's you can still tell a story, a false story about what happened in 1963, or any event for that matter. But now the history books say that this happened because we know this happened, and those trials helped establish that history. Those trials put forward a version of that history that complemented the rigorous journalism and historical work that had been done about those events. So you can say what you want about them, but if you say something that's contrary to that history, you just look like a fool. If you say something that's contrary to that history, you're wrong. There's no counter narrative anymore about those. And so that work of getting down what happened, I think, is in a way it's a political act, I think, in a way, because it is getting down in a way that is again, you can argue with it all you want, but it's been proven out, it's been fact checked, it's been held up to light, and there's something powerful to that when you're not able to do something else. I've been well, we won't get into actual politics, but there are people who are documenting day by day what's happening right now. There's an incredible podcast, if people haven't listened to it, called Slow Burn, the first season of which looks at sort of a day by day micro history of Watergate, which is something we all think think we know about, but it really looks at the the kind of day to day turns and twists that story took back when it happened, and I think there's real power to that.
Okay, but we are in a moment where some of those stories are being blanked out. We were just hearing that information about military veteran Medgar Evers has been removed at Arlington. And the predominantly Japanese fighting unit that did amazing things in Italy in World War II, not there on the Pentagon website anymore. What do we need to do to keep that history sufficiently alive that it's accessible?
I mean, I don't know. I read all these things too, and they're greatly troubling to me. But then I start thinking that this is all of these moves are just a true sign of weakness, of real terror, that the world has changed and left certain ways of thinking about the world behind, and that you can eradicate somehow the evidence of the country doing the right thing, the evidence of the country wrestling with its racial history, the evidence of the country, coming to its senses to acknowledge the multiracial, pluralistic society we live in. You can erase those websites, but that is a fundamental part of the American story at this point in our history, and you can't change that. So, I mean, not to get too partisanly political about it, but the Democrats may be real flat-footed right now, and they are, as an opposition party to this autocratic movement, but they won't be forever. And I'm not talking about the political party. I'm talking about the people of this country who understand the value of this pluralistic society, who understand the sort of the marvel of the founding documents, as much in need of revision as many of them need, the promise that those documents provided to have a civil war that could then somehow result in reunion. And it just there's ways in which the history of this country is immutable, and it's something to be incredibly proud of, as much as we acknowledge all the terrible parts of our past as well. And the acknowledgement of those terrible parts makes us stronger in many ways. And I think that's the thing that folks are so terrified by right now. And so the attempt to erase all of this, I just don't think is going to happen. I know that it's happening on the internet. I know that it's happening. You challenge universities. But think of the number of people across the political spectrum whose lives were so greatly enriched by education, whose diseases have been cured by science, whose understanding of the biological world has been so greatly influenced by the research that we do in this country. This is a horrible, tough, difficult time for sure. But I take heart that there are a people here. They just need to be directed. They need to be motivated. They need to be mobilized. They need to have a leader or several leaders who come out and say, here's what we're doing, and here's why we're making the argument about the future of the country. And I don't know. I don't look around and see lots of people rejoicing in the street about the not being burdened by the story of Jackie Robinson anymore, for instance. I see instead a group of people caught completely blindsided by the rapid pace of change and getting ready to fight like hell. That's what I see personally. But I'm trying also to stick with that belief and be optimistic. It's not, I'm
I've
not
never seen
naturally
you
there.
optimistic.
I
This is amazing. I
don't
love
know,
this. This
man.
is
I don't know.
optimistic Andy.
I know it's real weird. I don't know.
It is weird. Well, I think you're right, and I think that there are. I mean, if you want to see, another people who felt dispossessed were the white community in Selma, and as much as they try to, eradicate that history or make that history go away, it doesn't. It doesn't go away. It won't go away. You can try to make it go away, but it's not going to go away. And I think the truth will out always, and I think that. Uh, I think the key right now is like how do you focus your work and your attention, and how do you give that attention the time and the energy that it needs to sort of keep yourself sane and functional and happy, but also like to do something concrete. And that's a different answer for all of us.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes it's important to take a longer view. It took you years to work this story. It will not be the work of a few days or a week to respond to current craziness in the nation. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Well, not to toot your horn too much, Gordon, but when you think about the work that you all did, and you look at the impact of that, not just in the culture, but like, I mean, as a very minor example of its impact, I passed through Montgomery. I've been passing through back and forth from Birmingham to South Alabama a lot lately, and I've been going through Montgomery, and I've stopped at the EGI's memorial several times, and it's always full. And that place should not exist. If in a logical world, don't get me wrong, it should exist. I'm glad it exists, but the politics of the state and the way that most things get done in the state, that place that it exists is a miracle, and that has a lot to do with the way that Brian Stevenson and EJI went about securing the land and getting the funding for the memorial, and it was shrewd and it enabled this thing that it enabled the vision that had to happen for it to happen, but it's happened, and I think that history is not going anywhere. That monument's not going anywhere. And one of the most conservative places in the country, a place where all these stories took place, there is this monument that has upended tourism in the state, and for the better,
yes.
and brought a history, made a history alive that it wasn't. And so I think there are, we for all the horrors going on, there's this persistent, lasting hope that I think that can all drive us as well.
And that's I think that's particularly true of what has been created in Montgomery. Just superb interpretive work is being done there. But the state of Mississippi, for crying out loud, built a wonderful civil rights museum that tells the story of what it took in Mississippi. Not a pretty story, but state dollars used for that. A friend of mine was worried that it's a two Mississippis museum, one just general state history and one civil rights. And he said, well, the white schools are all going to go to the general history, and the predominantly black schools will go to the civil rights. And that may be true, but the general history side also tells the story very honestly. And it's encouraging for those of us who've been at it for a while to see, in these two improbable states, a little bit of honesty. How refreshing.
A little bit.
Yes.
Not everywhere.
Yeah, we shouldn't go over
Yeah.
with it, but obviously there's a white angle and there's a black angle on what happened in Selma. How aware was Black Selma of the craziness, the fictionalizing that was going on in the white neighborhoods?
It's a good question. I mean, I think I'm trying to remember. I mean, I think there are people that we interviewed for the story, Black people in Selma for the story, who were not at all surprised by that narrative and by anything that happened, frankly, regarding the story. And then there were people who just didn't want to talk to us, understandably, because, I mean, as one man said to us, who we were trying to, in our search for these tapes, we were trying to chase down the origin of this counter narrative.
Mhm.
We had heard that there were tapes made of the trial where this counter narrative was basically espoused by the defense attorney, and so we spent many days and hours and weeks looking for these tapes or any relic of these tapes or anyone who went to the trial. And Clark, of course, had gone to the trial because he was called to testify, but he was only there for his testimony, and then he wasn't there for the rest of it. And so we were looking for anyone who attended the trial. We heard the names of some Black folks who were growing up in Selma, some younger folks who had gone to the trial, and went to try to talk to this one guy who still lived in Selma, who'd left and come back to Selma at some point. And he said, "Why would I want to talk to you about this white guy, Jim Reeb, when there are any number of Black people who were lynched and killed in this town in my lifetime? Why not tell their story?" And there's no answer for that. And so, I think that there were people who had a good reason to not want to talk to us. But then I also think that there were people who felt that it wasn't a risk, but there was a little bit of a risk to putting your neck out to tell your side of the story, even all these years later. And so I think that they were aware, to your question, I think that many, if not all of them, are aware of the story, but also that story, it's not just the rest of the country and civil rights history where that story has been forgotten, but because of where the Reeb attack and murder happened in the arc of even the voting rights campaign, those few months of the voting rights campaign, but also the sort of broader civil rights movement, it's largely forgotten even in Selma. I mean, it's not what people talk about in Selma, in part because Jim Reeb's not from there.
Mhm.
Jimmy Lee Jackson, not from Selma, but he's from the area.
Yeah.
And so I think when people think about even those intense few months of the voting rights campaign in Dallas County, uh, it's down the list of
Mhm.
notable events for many people who live there.
Yeah. Well, hundreds of people were putting themselves on the line. You know, if you went to the courthouse, you could lose your job, you could lose your house, your family could suffer all sorts of consequences. Who's going to say that you're a hero?
Right.
Yeah.
At one point, while we were looking for records, we came across, I don't know, dozens of shoeboxes of mugshots from, you know, a very brief period, and I would say 63 to 65, 66. It's remarkable how many people were, detained. I mean, they Camp Selma, they had like a detention center, basically, no. So yeah, it was not easy for anyone, but especially if you were black.
Yeah. 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 Oh, do you think it really cemented the lie that it was adopted by the defense in the trial?
I think it was really born there, honestly. I think it was really the way that we often thought about it. I think we talked about it on the show this way, but the theory was that the Reeb attack happens in early March of 63, I mean
I
65, and then the trial happened in December of that year. Is that right?
Hmm.
think so.
And so the Voting Rights Act was passed, and he makes the speech shortly thereafter, and then it's passed in September, I believe,
Yeah, August, September.
August,
Yeah,
September.
late summer.
So by the time Reeb is attacked,
Mm.
the Voting Rights Act is passed, and the trial happens. So by the time the trial comes to fruition, the defense essentially says they needed a white martyr to pass the Civil Rights Act, and they got a white martyr. It felt like a foregone conclusion to the jurors at that point in
Mhm.
time. Selma had been a target for the Civil Rights Movement because of the hot-headed sheriff Jim Clark, because there's a number of reasons why. The overreaction that led to Jimmy Lee Jackson's death had been the catalyst for the march. The cameras had been there on Bloody Sunday to telegraph that story across the world.
Mm.
And that's what had brought Reeb there. Everything sort of lined up in the defense's argument. So they had almost everything they needed to pass the Voting Rights Act, but they really needed something even more visceral than that. They needed the death of this white man. I mean, LBJ even says the death of this good man. And he mentions him in the speech, right? So I think that for the defense attorney and for the formulation of the narrative for White Selma, uh, the sequence of events was almost confirmation of their theory in a way. And it is also just factually true. I'm sorry, I'm the son of an attorney, I guess, but it is factually true that he's attacked on the street and he dies not in Selma, but in Birmingham several
Mhm.
hours later.
Mhm.
This is often how conspiracy theories work. There is something that is true, that's verifiable. There's a way to interpret that truth, and understand it in a complex way. But there's another way to use those truths selectively and come to a totally different conclusion. That's how almost all conspiracy theories work. And so, in a way, that's what happened here. He got beat here. They roughed him up a little. There was a black doctor who looked at him here, but that black doctor was not credible to White Selma. They
Mhm.
didn't do much to really, they didn't document what sort of medical procedure had happened there. So at trial, there's no real concrete evidence that, not to mention the fact that my personal
Oh
axe to
God,
grind against
here
the
we go.
prosecutor who does not get he does not get what he deserves in our show, but that's all right. It's a long process telling a big complex story like this. But Blanchard McLeod, the county solicitor who was the prosecutor of the trial, did everything he could to throw the trial. He mounted almost no defense. And actually, we interviewed very close to the end of his life a New York Times reporter who had been in Selma at the time, and he was living outside D.C. when we interviewed him in 2018. And he himself was a little aphagic and didn't remember. He remembered very clearly his conversations with Blanchard McLeod, and he had said to him, Blanchard said, "There's no way I can win this case," and he said, "Well, why are you even prosecuting?" He said, "Because you bastards keep coming down here and digging this up. Basically, the press is looking at us. I've got to take it to trial, but we're not going to win it." And he was determined not to win it. There was no real attempt at all to win that case. So not only did the counter narrative function and operate compellingly for that audience who was captive to that story, but the defense did almost nothing to try and change the minds of the jury. I mean, again, it goes without saying it's an all-white jury of Selma natives mostly.
Yeah, it's really quite an amazing story, and I'm so glad that you two put in the years to unearth it and get those voices. I can't imagine how many glasses of iced tea you must have gone through in these visits to people who initially, didn't want to talk to you fellas, but maybe the third or fourth or fifth time, okay, I think I remember a little bit. You really did something for our understanding of what happened there in Selma. We are getting to the time when we should wrap up, and we will move on from here to conversation. If you've tuned in to the webinar, keep track of the other link that's been posted in the chat and shift over to that, because Chip and Andy and I will be there and we'll deal with your questions. We may go off on some tangents that we didn't get to in this hour together, but it should be a very interesting conversation. Please do consider contributing to the work of the Living Legacy Project. We are trying to not just continue, but to grow and to do even more. As was mentioned at the outset, next week we start a new, to us, itinerary for a pilgrimage in the low country of Georgia and South Carolina. And we have other webinars coming up. We will shortly be hiring a new executive director, and we need to give that person a good running start. And if a pilgrimage sounds intriguing to you, we have scheduled next September and October pilgrimages, one to Alabama, including Selma, and one to Mississippi. We'll be visiting Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We'll be visiting the EJI museums in Montgomery. Check our website. Registration for those pilgrimages should open next week. So if you want to be on the bus, here's your chance. And Chip and Andy, it has been delightful reconnecting with you. Viewing audience, these two guys wasted a couple of hours talking to me.
Not true.
We still talk about your apartment, how wonderful it is.
They got absolutely nothing that they could use in the
Got
podcast.
great stories. That's
That's
all
not
we're
true.
after, really.
Well,
Honestly,
no.
memories and
But
stories and experiences with other people. That's what it's about.
I really appreciate what they've done and look forward to spending time with them in the next segment. So thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much, Gordon.
Thank y'all very much. It's been great.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Okay.
We'll see you in the other chat then.